The writer did not want to hand her the paper. She could see it in the way he held the folded sheet against his saddle horn, pressing it flat with his thumb as if keeping it still might keep it from being real. Behind her, wood smoke leaked sideways through the cabin wall, not from the chimney, from the logs themselves. And a child coughed under a flour sack quilt in a room where the lamp flame bent toward the cracks it should not have been able to find. The iron latch burned her fingers when she reached for it. The writer looked at the child, then at the smoke threading through the chinking, then at the woman standing in a doorway that did not fully close. He said the claim could be contested if her winter residency failed. Marit Breka had been a widow for 9 days when she understood that the cabin would kill her before the winter did. Tollef was buried on the slope behind the timber draw under a cairn of flat stones because the ground was already too hard for a proper grave. The burial cost $11, $7 for the pine box the freighter charged double to haul, $4 for the minister who rode out from Rapid City and kept calling Tollef by the wrong name. Marit did not correct him. She stood with her hand on Oren's shoulder while the minister said Thomas twice and Tollef once, and she watched the soil go back over the box, and she thought about the number that mattered now. $32. That was what remained after the burial, after the last supply run Tollef had made before the wagon tongue dropped and caught him across the chest. $32 to hold a 160-acre claim through a Dakota winter with a 6-year-old boy who was not hers by blood, but was hers by every other measure. Oren was her dead sister's child. He had been with them since he was 3. He called her Marit, not mother, and he had a cough that worsened whenever the wind turned north. The cabin stood 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep. Tollef had cut the logs green from ponderosa pine the previous spring, saddle-notched them with more enthusiasm than skill, and raised 7-foot walls under a sodden pole roof patched with tar paper. One iron stove sat near the center, missing a fire brick that Tollef had planned to replace before the first freeze. 2 small windows faced south. The door hung on leather hinges, and the walls breathed. Marit had noticed it the first night after Tollef's death, when she sat awake beside Oren's cot and watched the lamp flame. The flame bent, not toward the stove draft, not toward the door, toward the north wall, where 12 slits of gray daylight showed between the logs like claw marks. The mud and clay chinking that Tollef had packed into the joints was already pulling away from the green wood. Every night the logs contracted in the cold, and every morning the gaps were a little wider, and every afternoon the sun warmed the wood just enough to shift the mud without receding it. She pressed her palm flat against the north wall. Air moved across her skin like breath from a sick animal, steady, thin, and cold enough to make her fingers ache in 4 seconds. The stove ate 1 armload of wood every 2 hours when the wind blew. She had counted. 1.5 cords stacked against the east wall outside, covered with a canvas that had already begun to rot at the grommets. She needed 6 cords minimum to survive until April if the walls kept leaking. Buying 4 cords would cost $16 plus hauling, but flour, salt pork, lamp oil, nails, and the medicine Oren needed for his cough would consume $23 before February. 32 minus 23 left 9. 4 cords cost 16. The math did not work. It could not be made to work, and she could not leave. The claim was the only asset in her name. Tollef's signature sat in the land office in Rapid City, and Marit's name was on the occupancy affidavit as his spouse. If she abandoned the cabin, she lost the 160 acres, the improvements, and the $11 she had already buried in the hillside. The nearest relatives were 500 miles east in Wisconsin. Rail passage for herself and Oren would cost more than she had. And arriving penniless with a sick child and no husband was not rescue. It was a different kind of death, slower and indoors. There was also the matter of Gideon Vale. Vale owned the dry goods store in the settlement 8 miles south, and he held a signed note for tools and stove credit that Tolef had taken on during the building. The note said $41. Marit had seen the original receipt. It said 26. The difference was Vale's arithmetic, and there was no one alive now to dispute it. The day after the burial, Vale rode out with a man Marit did not recognize. He did not dismount. He sat his horse in the yard and told her he was sorry about Tolef and that he had purchased the debt from himself, which meant he now held it personally, which meant he could call it whenever he chose. He offered to buy the claim for $40. $40 for 160 acres, a cabin, a stove, a mule, and a winter's worth of Tolef's labor. Marit said nothing. Vale took her silence as confusion. He explained, the way a man explains direction to a child, that if she could not maintain occupancy through the winter, he would contest the claim with the land office and take the improvements as debt settlement. He said this was generous. He said most men in his position would not ride out to offer anything at all. Marit said, the debt was $26. Vale smiled. Interest, he said. He rode away. The man with him never spoke. That night, Marit fed the stove until the cabin held warmth for almost an hour after the fire died, and she lay on the floor beside Oren's cot with her coat over a blanket and her boots still on, and she listened to the wind find every seam in the north wall, and she understood two things. First, that Vale would not wait for her to fail. He would help her fail. Second, that the cabin as Tolef had built it was not a shelter. It was a sieve. It let heat out faster than the stove could push it in, and every stick of wood she burned was half wasted because the wind carried the warmth through the walls before it could settle. She needed the walls to stop breathing. Until they did, no amount of firewood would be enough. Anson Prawl arrived on the 4th day after the burial, riding a dun mare and carrying a canvas satchel full of paper and a folding rule. He was 58, thin-armed and thick through the chest, with a beard trimmed close enough that the cold found his jaw. He had been a carpenter and bridge repairman in the army, and the county now paid him a small fee to inspect claim improvements, to verify that homesteaders were actually building, actually living, actually doing the work the law required before the land became theirs. He did not introduce himself with sympathy. He swung off the mare, tied her to the fence post Tolef had never finished setting, and walked the property with the folding rule in one hand and the other hand touching the logs, the way a doctor touches a rib cage. Marit followed him. Oren watched from the doorway, coughing into his sleeve. Prawl pressed his thumb into the chinking on the south wall. A chunk of dried clay fell out and landed on his boot. He looked at it, then at Marit. "Who mixed this?" he asked. "My husband." "Too much sand, not enough straw." And he packed it dry. Prawl moved to the east wall, running his hand along the joint between the second and third logs. "Greenwood, cut in spring?" "April. April." He said it the way a man says the name of a disease. "These logs have been drying all summer. They will keep shrinking until January. Every joint is going to open." He crouched at the sill log and pressed his fingers underneath. Wind audibly hissed through the gap. "Sill is uneven. Foundation stones shifted. You have got daylight under here I could slide a playing card through." He stood and opened his satchel. "I will be honest with you, Mrs. Brecky. You have half a cabin. You have 1.5 cords of wood. You need 6 minimum. Your stovepipe collar is cracked. I can see soot staining on the ceiling, which means smoke is leaking into the room when the wind backs up. Your roof is sawed over poles, which is sound enough if the poles hold, but your tar paper is already lifting at the north edge." Marit said, "What does the inspection require?" Prawl looked at her. occupancy, improvement, a dwelling that a reasonable person could call habitable. He paused. I am not going to pass this today. What would make you pass it? Sealed walls, adequate fuel, a stovepipe that does not poison your air. He folded the rule. Mud is what poor people use until they can afford lime. Then they patch it every thaw until they die. He put the rule in the satchel. I do not say that to be cruel. I say it because lime mortar costs money you do not have, and re-chinking costs time you will spend until the logs stop moving, which they will not do for 2 years. If I cannot pass inspection, then your occupancy is not proved, and anyone holding a debt against this claim can contest it. Veil. He meant veil. Prawl mounted the mare. He looked down at her, and for a moment his expression shifted from official assessment to something that might have been regret. Get someone to help you, a neighbor, a church, someone with a team and a saw. Marit said, I do not have neighbors with teams to spare. Prawl nodded once, as if she had confirmed something he already knew, and rode out. Inside the cabin, Orin coughed. The lamp flame bent toward the north wall. The wind had not stopped since Tolef died, and it would not stop until April, and between now and April, every crack in the walls was a mouth that swallowed heat and spat back cold. Marit stood in the yard, with frost forming on the canvas-covered woodpile, and worked the numbers again. 1.5 cords, 6 needed, $23 for supplies, $9 remaining, 4 cords at $16, a debt of 41 dong, or 26, depending on whose arithmetic you trusted. An inspector who would not sign, a merchant who would contest, a child who coughed louder every night. She could not cut enough wood alone once deep snow sealed the timber draw. She could not buy enough wood and still feed Orin. She could not repair the chinking because the logs would keep shrinking and the clay would keep cracking and the wind would keep entering no matter how many times she packed it. The math did not work in any direction she turned it. The idea did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as failure. Marit spent 3 days repacking chinking. She mixed clay with straw and river sand the way Tolef had done, wetting it until it held shape, pressing it into the joints with a flat stick, smoothing it with her palms until her hands cracked and bled in the cold. Each morning the repairs looked solid, pale stripes of fresh clay between dark logs, sealed tight, no daylight showing. Each night the temperature dropped and the green logs contracted and the clay pulled free at the edges. By the 3rd morning, 4 of the 12 slits on the north wall had reopened. 2 new ones appeared on the east wall where she had not even worked. The clay was not failing because she mixed it wrong. It was failing because the logs were still moving and would keep moving for months. The mud could not hold something that refused to stay still. On the 3rd night, Orin coughed so hard that his nose bled onto the flour sack quilt. Marit cleaned his face with a rag dipped in warm water and sat beside him until he slept. Then she carried the lamp to the north wall and held it close to the seams. She watched the flame. It bent. Every joint, every crack, every check in the surface of the logs where the wood had split during drying, the flame found air moving through all of them. Not gusts, not howling wind, just a constant, thin, invisible current that pulled warmth out of the cabin the way a sieve drains water. She set the lamp on the table and looked at the wall. The problem was not the gaps. The problem was the air. As long as air moved through the walls, the stove was fighting the wind directly, and the wind would always win because it never stopped, and the stove needed feeding every 2 hours. She did not need to fill the gaps. She needed to stop the air. The memory surfaced not as a story, but as a sensation. The smell of spruce smoke and hot resin. Her mother's hands, red-knuckled and rough, pressing a warm bead of pine pitch into the seam of a cracked wooden washtub. Randy Brecka had been born in Finland before emigrating to Wisconsin, and she had carried with her a working knowledge of resin the way other women carried recipes for bread. Resin goes where water cannot. That was what her mother said, pressing the warm amber into the crack, smoothing it with a wet thumb so it would not stick to her skin. Pitch grips rough wood. It sheds water. It hardens in cold air, but does not crack like clay because it is give. It bends instead of breaking. Marit had watched her mother seal wash tubs, patch boot soles, and waterproof a milk bucket with nothing more than pine resin, heated in an iron cup and thickened with a little ash. The patches lasted years. They darkened with age and grew harder, but they held. She looked at the north wall. The logs were ponderosa pine. The forests around the timber draw were ponderosa pine. Every scarred trunk and broken branch in those woods bled resin when wounded. The resin was free. It was everywhere. And it did the one thing clay could not do. It stuck to wood that was still moving. The logic built itself piece by piece. Clay filled gaps, but pulled away when the logs dried. Lime mortar would hold better, but cost money she did not have. Boards would require lumber she could not haul alone. Cloth or newspaper stuffed inside the walls might slow the wind, but it would not seal the exterior. Rain and snow would still enter the wood and freeze inside the joints, pushing them wider. But pitch. Hot pitch brushed over the outside of the logs would fill the checks, coat the joints, seal the corners, grip the wood, harden in the cold, and shed water and snow from the surface. It would not stop the logs from shrinking. Nothing would stop that. But it would create a skin over the outside of the wall that the wind could not penetrate. A shell. A continuous, flexible, weatherproof coat that turned the cabin from a sieve into a sealed box. And if the wind stopped entering, every stick of wood would last longer. The stove would heat the air inside the cabin instead of replacing air that was constantly leaking out. 1.5 cords might not behave like 6, but they might behave like 3, and 3 might be enough if she could cut more before the snow closed the draw. Marit crossed the cabin to where a split log sat on the warming shelf beside the stove. A bead of amber resin had oozed from a crack in the wood and hardened there, glossy and cold. She pried it loose with her thumbnail and held it near the stove's heat. The bead softened. It did not crumble. It did not melt into liquid. It became pliable, sticky, and warm. She pressed it into the crack beside the window frame with the head of a nail. It filled the crack and gripped the wood on both sides. By morning, frost had formed on the clay seams around the window. White crystals furred every joint she had repacked. But the resin plug was clean. No frost, no ice, no air moving through it at all. The flame did not bend when she held the lamp beside it. One bead of resin, one crack. Proof. Marit told no one what she planned. She did not tell Elihu Marsh, the neighboring teamster whose claim lay 2 miles east, and she did not tell his wife, Cora. She did not tell Prawl, who would have called it unproven. She especially did not tell Vale, who would have called it proof of incompetence. She started gathering resin on the 5th day after the idea, walking the timber draw above Rapid Creek with a flour sack and a short knife. She cut old resin blisters from scarred ponderosa trunks, amber lumps the size of her thumb, some hard and brittle, some still soft beneath a crusted surface. She collected pitch-rich knots from deadfall, chunks of wood so saturated with resin that they weighed twice what clean pine weighed and smelled sharp enough to sting her eyes. She worked for 3 hours each morning while Orrin slept, returning with sacks that stuck to her coat and left amber smears on everything she touched. The work made her visible. The timber draw was shared ground, not anyone's claim, but used by every homesteader within 5 miles for firewood, fence posts, and building material. Marit was not cutting trees. She was only scoring old blisters and hauling deadfall knots. But the sight of a woman kneeling on frozen ground, scraping sticky lumps off pine bark and stuffing them into flour sacks, attracted attention. Children from the marsh place trailed behind her one morning, watching. They started calling her Amber Widow. The name spread. Gideon Vale heard the name before he heard the reason. He rode out on a Tuesday, not to inspect, not to negotiate, to watch. He sat his horse at the edge of the draw and observed Marit filling a sack with pitch knots, while pine needles clung to her sleeves and resin darkened her hands to the wrists. He said nothing that day. But 2 days later, at the settlement store, he told the men around the stove what he had seen. "She's gathering pine knots," he said. "Sackfuls, filling her cabin with fuel and pine tar. I suppose when the fire finds it, we'll see the smoke from town." Someone laughed. Vale continued. "She's going to paint her cabin with it, like varnish on a coffin, like a woman who has decided to die indoors and wants to look tidy for the occasion." He paused for the laugh to settle. Then he said what he actually meant. A woman careless enough to smear fuel on a log cabin should not be trusted with a child. That was not gossip. That was a threat aimed at the inspector, at the community, at anyone who might be asked to certify Marit's fitness to keep Orrin on a homestead claim. If Vale could make the method sound reckless, he could undermine her occupancy, her custody, and her claim in a single stroke. The store gossip multiplied. Women moved their skirts away from Marit's resin-stained hem when she came for salt. A freighter refused to lend her a kettle, saying he did not want his beans tasting like turpentine for the rest of the winter. Vale offered through a neighbor to buy her ruined cabin before it became a fire loss. His price had not changed from $40. Elihu Marsh told Marit privately that he would testify she had tried to maintain the claim, but not that the method made sense. "I respect work," he said, standing in her yard with his arms crossed over his coat. "But you are talking about painting a house with a substance that catches fire, in a building heated by a stove that throws sparks, with a 6-year-old inside." Marit said, "A lantern has air inside it. Fire needs air. I am stopping air." Elihu stared at her. "That is not an answer a person gives who is worried about burning." "I am worried about freezing," Marit said. "The burning I can control. The freezing I cannot." Elihu shook his head, but he did not walk away. He stood there looking at the north wall, where 12 slits of daylight still showed between the logs, and he said nothing else. Behind him, his middle child, Ruth, stood in the wagon bed and watched Marit with the expression of a girl studying something she was not yet old enough to name. Vale's confrontation came 4 days later. He blocked Marit outside the store. 2 men stood behind him, not with him exactly, but not stepping away either. Vale said, "A stove throws sparks. Pitch catches sparks. You have built yourself a lantern with a child inside." Marit looked at him. She did not raise her voice. She said, "A lantern has air. I am stopping air." Vale blinked. It was the first time she had stated the principle aloud to someone who opposed her, and it landed not as a defense but as a correction. She was not coating the cabin with fuel. She was removing the oxygen pathway that fire needed. A sealed wall with pitch on the outside and a stove on the inside was not a lantern. A lantern was open. She was closing everything. Vale recovered. "You are a widow with a dead man's claim and a sick boy and $30. You are not an engineer. You are not a builder. You are a woman who has decided to play with fire because she cannot afford lime." He looked at the men behind him. When the cabin burns, I will be happy to purchase whatever remains of the property. Marit walked past him. She bought 3 pounds of salt, 1 tin of lamp oil, and a sack of cornmeal. She did not respond to his prediction. She did not need to. She needed the salt. The first attempt at rendering resin nearly cost her the cabin. Marit built a fire ring in the yard, flat stones arranged in a circle with a coal bed inside, the way she had seen her mother heat pitch in Wisconsin. She set a battered iron kettle on the stones, filled it with resin chunks and pitch knots broken to the size of walnuts, and waited. The resin melted slowly at first, going soft and golden at the edges while the center chunks held their shape. Marit stirred with a green stick. The smell was sharp, turpentine and hot sugar, and something bitter underneath like scorched hair. Smoke rose thin and white. Then the temperature crossed a line she could not see. The resin foamed. The surface bubbled and spat. Smoke thickened from white to gray to a dense, oily black that stung her eyes and coated her throat. A drop of boiling pitch landed on her wrist and stuck. She jerked her hand back, and the stick knocked the kettle sideways. Liquid pitch ran over the stones, found the coal bed, and a tongue of orange flame licked up from the spill and caught the fumes hanging above the kettle. Marit grabbed the kettle handle with her coat sleeve and burned through the wool. The flames climbed. Orrin, standing 20 feet away near the cabin door, screamed, and then a pole came down on the kettle from behind, knocked it off the stones, and flipped it upside down in the snow. A damp hide landed over the coal bed. The flames went out in a hiss of steam and black smoke. Marit turned around. Barbro Asen stood at the edge of the fire ring holding the pole, a peeled pine branch, 8 feet long, the kind used to push things out of reach. She was 66 years old, narrow through the shoulders and thick through the hips, with hands that looked like they had been made from saddle leather and used for 60 years without oil. Her coat was elk hide, smoke-cured, patched at both elbows with canvas. She did not look at the ruined kettle. She looked at Marit's wrist. "Show me," she said. Marit held out her arm. A welt the width of a coin was already rising, the skin white at the center where the pitch had stuck, and red at the edges where she had torn it away. Barbro took Marit's wrist and turned it in the light. "Resin burn," she said. "Not as bad as tar. You got most of it off." She released the wrist. "You did not clean the resin before you heated it." "Clean it?" "Bark, needles, dirt. They burn. The resin foams around the impurities and spits them out. You must skim the raw resin first, pick out the bark, strain the needles. Then it melts smooth." Marit looked at the overturned kettle. Black pitch had frozen in a glossy puddle on the snow, already hardening. "How do you know this?" Barbro picked up her pole and rested it on her shoulder. "Because I did it wrong the first time, too. And the second. By the third time, I had no eyebrows left, and my husband called me the tar devil." She did not smile exactly, but the lines around her eyes deepened. "I cooked tar for 8 years at the lumber camps on Lake Superior. My husband ran a kiln until it fell on him. After that, I ran it." She looked at the cabin, at the logs, at the 12 slits of daylight on the north wall, visible even from the yard. "You are going to coat this," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." Barbro nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when they have weighed something and found it not foolish but difficult. She said, "Show me where you are gathering." They walked to the timber draw together. Barbro moved slowly, but she moved with the certainty of someone who had been in forests all her life and understood them the way Marit understood numbers, not as scenery, but as inventory. She stopped at a scarred ponderosa and ran her finger along the cut Marit had made in the bark. Shallow, Barbro said. Angled, not girdling the tree. She looked at Marit. You are not stealing from the tree. You're asking where it already bleeds. My mother taught me. Finnish? Born there, raised in Wisconsin. Barbro nodded again. Then you know what resin is. You just do not know what pitch is yet. She tapped the bark. Resin is what the tree gives. Pitch is what you make from it. The difference is fire, patience, and knowing when to stop. Tell us in the comments, have you ever built something everyone else thought was foolish because they could not yet see the problem you were solving? That afternoon, Barbro showed Marit the first of 3 things that would determine whether the coating held or failed. She brought a tin cup of raw resin chunks to Marit's fire ring and picked through them with a bent spoon, flicking out bark fragments, pine needles, and flakes of dirt. She worked in silence for 10 minutes, sorting clean amber pieces from contaminated ones. When she was done, the clean pile was barely half the original volume. Everything you remove now is a crack you will not have in the wall, Barbro said. Impurities do not burn off. They burn. The resin foams around them, traps gas, and when the coat cools, the gas pockets crack open. You get a surface that looks sealed but is full of holes. She rebuilt the coal bed, lower this time, spread wider, with flat stones shielding the kettle from direct flame. Never let the fire touch the kettle. Coals only, radiant heat. If the smoke turns blue-black, you're burning the resin, not melting it. Pull the kettle off and wait. Marit watched the resin melt. This time it softened evenly, going golden, then amber, then a deep reddish brown. No foam, no spattering. The smoke stayed thin and white, rising straight in the still air. Now, Barbro said. She took a handful of crushed charcoal from a pouch at her belt and sifted it into the hot resin. Charcoal gives it tooth. Without it, the pitch is too smooth. It skins over and peels in sheets when ice forms beneath it. The charcoal makes the surface rough enough to grip itself. She stirred. The resin darkened. Then she added a second handful, this one gray-white sifted wood ash. Ash gives it stiffness. Charcoal alone makes it too sticky. Ash makes it set harder, but too much ash and it becomes brittle. She pinched a lump of something pale and waxy from a folded cloth. Tallow, deer, if you have it. Beef will do. A walnut-sized lump per kettle, no more. The fat keeps the pitch from shattering in deep cold. Without it, a January night will crack your coat like old pottery. Marit watched the mixture darken and thicken. The smell changed, still sharp with turpentine, but now undercut with something smoky and warm, like a wood shop after a long day. Barbro dipped the bent spoon and lifted a ribbon of hot pitch. It stretched between the spoon and the surface, thinning but not breaking. She let it cool for 10 seconds, then pressed it between her thumb and finger. It gave slightly. It did not crack. That is pitch, she said. Your mother knew resin. I am teaching you what comes next. The afternoon light was already going amber when they carried the kettle to the south wall. Marit cut a ruined broom flat and bound the bristles tight with wire. Barbro showed her how to load the broom, dip, let the excess drain for 3 seconds, then press and spread upward, forcing the hot pitch into the checks and seams before it cooled. The first stroke left a dark, glossy stripe on the pale log. Pitch filled a crack that Marit's clay had failed to hold 3 times. It gripped the wood on both sides of the gap. It did not drip. It did not run. It set as the cold air touched it, darkening from amber to brown-black, rough where the charcoal caught, smooth where the broom had pressed. 1 stroke, 1 sealed crack, and 500 square feet of wall remaining. Oren stood in the doorway and watched. The south wall was 16 feet long. He made a charcoal mark on the door frame, 1. The first of 72 lengths they would need to cover every wall, every corner, every sill joint, every window frame, and every check in every log that the wind had learned to enter. The sun dropped behind the ridge. The temperature fell. Marit's burned wrist throbbed under a strip of cloth Barbro had tied with salve underneath. The first gallon of pitch had covered perhaps 8 running feet of wall, and they needed 40 gallons to coat everything. Barbro looked at the sky. How many days until the cold front? The freighters say 2 weeks, maybe less. Barbro pulled her coat tighter. Then we do not sleep late. She walked back toward the creek crossing and her half dugout without saying goodbye, because she would be back at dawn, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. Marit stood in the yard beside a half-coated wall and a cooling kettle and a child's charcoal mark on the door frame, and she understood that the work ahead was enormous and that the help she had found was real but fragile. Barbro was 66 and walked slowly and would not last forever, and that somewhere in the settlement Gideon Vale was telling anyone who listened that the Amber Widow was building a funeral pyre with a child inside. 3 walls uncoated, 2 gallons of pitch remaining, the north sill leaking, the timber draw closing with every inch of new snow, and the sky to the west turning the color of old iron, which meant the weather was thinking about changing its mind. Barbro arrived before dawn the next morning, carrying a hide sack of pitch knots she had collected from deadfall near her creek crossing. She dropped the sack by the fire ring without ceremony and crouched beside the cold kettle, scraping out the hardened residue with a flat stone. "How much resin did you gather yesterday?" she asked. 2 sacks, maybe 8 pounds each. Barbro shook her head. "Not enough. We need 35 to 40 gallons of usable coating for 1 heavy pass on all 4 walls, a second pass on the corners, sill line, roof line, and window frames. That is 50 gallons of raw mixture, which means at least 60 pounds of clean resin before we add charcoal, ash, and tallow." She looked at Marit. "How much do you have?" "Maybe 20 pounds, some of it dirty." "Then we have a third of what we need and less than 2 weeks to get the rest." They divided the work. Marit gathered in the mornings, walking the timber draw with her knife and flour sacks, cutting resin blisters, hauling deadfall knots on a canvas drag she built from a broken sled runner and rope. Barbro cleaned and sorted in the afternoons, picking through raw resin with her bent spoon, discarding bark and needles, testing hardness by pressing each lump between her fingers. Soft lumps went into the kettle first. Hard lumps were broken with a rock and soaked in warm water to release trapped dirt before heating. On the second day, Barbro taught Marit heat control. They built a new coal bed, wider and lower than the first, with a ring of flat stones around the perimeter to shield the kettle from wind gusts that could spike the temperature. Barbro showed her how to read the smoke. White smoke, thin and steady, meant the resin was melting properly. Gray smoke meant the temperature was climbing and the kettle should be pulled to the edge of the coals. Blue-black smoke meant the resin was burning, the volatile oils igniting inside the mixture, and the kettle had to come off immediately or the batch would char into useless slag. "You cannot fix a burned batch," Barbro said. "It goes bitter and brittle. You throw it away and start again, and every batch you lose is a day you do not have." They lost 1 batch on the 3rd day when a gust of wind pushed flame into the coal bed, and the temperature spiked before Marit could pull the kettle. The resin turned black and crumbled when it cooled, snapping like charred bread. 8 pounds of clean resin gone, half a day's gathering. Marit stared at the ruined batch. Barbro said nothing. She walked to the sack and began filling the kettle again. By the fourth day, Marit could read the smoke without thinking. Her hands learned the rhythm: stir, check color, stir, feel the heat rising from the surface, stir, watch the ribbon stretch from the spoon. Too thin meant too hot, too thick meant too cool, and the mixture would not flow into the cracks. The right consistency looked like cold honey poured from a height of 6 inches. A steady, unbroken thread that held its shape for 2 seconds before settling. On the 5th day, Barbro taught the third lesson: the body of the coating. They sat beside the fire ring with 3 piles arranged on a flat stone. Crushed charcoal ground between 2 rocks until it was the consistency of coarse flour. Sifted wood ash, strained through a scrap of worn linen until only the finest powder remained, and a lump of deer tallow Barbro had been carrying in her coat pocket, wrapped in a rag that smelled of smoke and animal fat. "Watch the order," Barbro said. She heated a small test batch, 2 cups of clean resin, until it ran smooth and amber. Then she added charcoal, 1 pinch at a time, stirring after each addition. Too much charcoal and the coat will not spread. It grabs the broom and tears. Too little, and the surface is too smooth. Ice forms under it and lifts it off the wood like a scab. She added ash next. Ash stiffens. It makes the coat set harder when it cools, but ash absorbs the oils that keep the pitch flexible, so if you add too much, the coat becomes glass. 1 hard frost, and it shatters. Last, the tallow. She pinched off a piece the size of a walnut and dropped it into the hot mixture. It sizzled, melted, and disappeared. Fat is the secret that nobody tells you because nobody thinks about it. Without fat, pitch is a summer material. It works in warm weather because it stays slightly soft. In January, when the air goes below 0, pitch without fat turns to stone and cracks the first time the logs shift. The tallow keeps it alive. She stirred the test batch and lifted a ribbon. It stretched, darkened, and cooled in the air without snapping. She wrapped it around a nail. It bent without breaking. She pressed it with her thumbnail. It dented but held its shape. "That is the mixture," she said. 2 parts resin, 1 part charcoal, half a part ash, and a walnut of fat per kettle. Give or take, every batch of resin is different. Every fire is different. You will learn to feel it. Marit wrote the proportions on the inside of a board with charcoal. Barbro watched her write and said, "Proportions are the skeleton. Patience is the muscle. If you rush the heating, the mixture separates. If you rush the application, the coat is too thin to seal. If you rush the curing, you trap moisture under the pitch, and it blisters in the first freeze." "How long does it cure?" "Cold air sets it in minutes, but the deep cure, the bonding to the wood, takes 2 or 3 cold nights. Do not touch it. Do not test it. Let the cold finish what the heat started." They coated the south wall in 2 days. 8 batches of pitch, applied in long upward strokes with the flat broom, Barbro following behind with a wooden paddle to force hot pitch into the deepest checks and tightest seams. The work was brutal. The pitch had to be applied hot, which meant constant trips between the fire ring and the wall, carrying the kettle with a pole threaded through the handle because the sides were too hot to touch, even through gloves. Each stroke had to go on before the previous one cooled, or the coat would not bond to itself, and a seam would form between old and new, a seam the wind could find. Marit's arms ached from the broom. Her wrist burn cracked open and bled into the bandage. Pitch stuck to her coat, her boots, her hair. Pine needles blew into the wet surface and stayed. The south wall, when finished, looked like something from a nightmare. Black gold, lumpy, studded with debris. glossy where the sun caught it and rough everywhere else. Oren walked along the base and made his charcoal marks. 16 feet of south wall, done. They moved to the east wall, 20 feet. Longer, with more checks in the logs because the east side caught the morning sun and dried faster. The checks were deep, some a half-inch wide, running the length of a log, revealing the pale interior wood that had never been exposed to weather. Marit filled each check with hot pitch before coating the surface, pressing the mixture in with the nail head, watching it grip the wood and darken as it set. On the third day of coating, a snow squall blew in from the northwest. It lasted 40 minutes. Fine, dry snow drove sideways into the wet pitch on the east wall, embedding thousands of ice crystals in the surface. When the squall passed and the sun returned, the crystals melted, and the surface of the fresh coat was pocked with tiny craters. The coat looked diseased. Marit stared at it, a day's work ruined. Barbro inspected it with her fingers, pressing and scraping. "Not ruined," she said. "The craters are shallow. The base coat held. We apply another pass over this section, and the new coat fills the holes." She looked at the sky. "But we cannot coat in snow. We wait for still air. Waiting costs them a day." The snow squall was followed by a gray, windless afternoon that Barbro declared ideal. They recoated the damaged section and pushed through the rest of the east wall before dark. 20 feet. Done. Oren marked it. The north wall was next. The worst wall. The one with 12 daylight slits and an uneven sill log and a foundation that had shifted until the bottom course sat crooked on its stones. Marit spent an entire morning just filling the sill gap, heating pitch to liquid thinness and pouring it along the base, watching it flow into the uneven space between log and stone, packing the remaining gaps with pitch-soaked rags cut from a worn petticoat. Barbro watched her work the sill and said, "Your mother would be proud of this." Marit did not look up. "My mother would tell me I'm slow." "Your mother would be right, but she would be proud," while she said it. They were 12 days into the work when Anson Prahl returned. He rode into the yard without announcement, dismounted, and stood looking at the south and east walls with an expression Marit could not read. The pitch coating had cured for over a week on those surfaces. The color had deepened to a dark brown black, still glossy in the angled light, rough with charcoal grit and the embedded debris that Marit had stopped trying to remove. It did not look like any cabin wall Prahl had ever inspected. It looked like something that had been dipped in molten sugar and left to harden. He walked to the east wall and pressed his knife into the cured surface. The blade left a shallow mark, a scratch, a dent, but the pitch did not crumble. It did not crack. It gave slightly under the blade and held. Prahl pulled the knife out and looked at the mark. He pressed his palm flat against the wall. He held it there for 10 seconds, then turned to Marit. "No air," he said. "No." "What is in this?" Marit told him. "Resin, charcoal, ash, tallow, harvested from the draw, rendered in a kettle, applied by hand." Prahl listened with the expression of a man being told something that contradicts a principle he has held for 30 years. He walked the length of the east wall, testing with his palm every 4 feet. At each point, his hand found the same thing, solid surface, no air movement, no give in the joints. He stopped at the corner where the east wall met the unfinished north wall. The contrast was immediate. On the coated side, the surface was sealed, dark, and silent. On the uncoated side, the clay chinking was cracked and loose, daylight showing through 3 joints, frost riming the exposed wood. He did not need to press his palm to the north wall. He could hear the air moving through it from 2 feet away. "I am not going to sign off on this today," Prahl said. Marit's stomach tightened. "Why?" Because the north wall is not finished, because I have never seen this material on a dwelling, and I do not know how it performs in severe weather, and because he paused, choosing his words the way a man chooses where to set his foot on bad ice. A wall is not proved in sunshine, Mrs. Brecke. It is proved in wind. He mounted his horse. Before he rode out, he turned back. Finish the north wall. If we get a blow and it holds, I will come back. Marit watched him ride toward the settlement road. Behind her, Barbro set the kettle on the coals without being asked. They finished the north wall in 3 more days. The sill took another full day. Marit crawled along the base on her knees, forcing hot pitch into gaps with a rag wrapped around a stick, burning her fingers twice through the cloth. The west wall, 16 feet, went faster because Tolov had notched those logs more carefully, and the checks were shallow. The final pass was corners, window frames, and the roof line joint where the wall logs met the sod and pole roof. Barbro could not climb. Her knees would not take the chair Marit balanced on to reach the upper seams. Marit did the high work alone, leaning from the chair with the broom in one hand and the kettle handle in the other, pitch dripping down her arm while the wind gusted and the chair rocked on frozen ground. The last seam was the northwest corner, where 2 logs met at the saddle notch joint, and a gap the width of her little finger let a blade of cold air through that she could feel from 3 feet away. She heated the pitch to thin and poured it into the notch, watching it fill the gap, grip the wood, and set. The blade of air stopped. She climbed down. Orrin was standing at the door with his charcoal. He made the final mark. 72 lengths, all 4 walls, all corners, sill to roof line. It was done. The cabin looked ugly. Black gold and lumpy, pine needles and snow grit embedded in the surface, glossy where the sun hit the south wall and matte where shadow kept the north side cold. The windows were framed in dark amber. The door frame was sealed. The sill line looked like a wound that had scabbed and healed rough. But when Marit stood inside and held the lamp, the flame did not move. She walked the perimeter slowly, holding the lamp at every joint, every corner, every check. The flame burned straight and steady, and still. For the first time since Tolov died, the air inside the cabin was not moving. That night she banked the stove at 9 and lay down with Orrin. He coughed twice, softly, and slept. She woke at 4 in the morning, expecting bitter cold, and found the cabin merely cool. The stove had coals. The water pail beside the bed was not frozen. She touched the surface with her finger, liquid. Not even a skin of ice. Before the coating, the pail froze solid by midnight, unless she fed the stove every 2 hours. After the coating, the water stayed liquid until morning with 1 late-night stoking. 1.5 cords of wood would not last the winter, but they would last far longer than they would have in a cabin that bled heat through every seam. The math was shifting, not solved, but bending in her direction for the first time. The day before the storm was warm, not spring warm. January warm, which in the Black Hills meant the air softened from bitter to merely sharp. Icicles dripped from the roof edge, and snow went wet at the surface while staying frozen underneath. The sky was pale blue, almost white, and the light had a quality that Merritt's mother had called weather light. Too bright, too even, too still. Elihu Marsh stopped by with a half cord of wood. He said he owed Tolov for help with fencing the previous autumn. He did not owe Tolov anything, and both he and Marit knew it. He stacked the wood without being asked and stood in the yard looking at the walls. Ugly, he said. Yes. Holds. The water pail does not freeze. Elihu considered this. He walked to the north wall and pressed his hand against it, the way he had seen Prahl do. He held it for 5 seconds. No air, he said, with the surprise of a man who had expected to be right and found he was wrong. No. And the fire risk? The pitch is on the outside. The stove is on the inside. There is nothing for a spark to catch between them unless the wall burns through, and log walls do not burn through from inside stove heat. Elihu looked at her. He was not converted, but he was no longer certain he was right. He said, "If this holds through a blow, I want to know how you mixed it." He left. The sky stayed too bright. The icicles kept dripping. Somewhere to the northwest, something was building. The sky changed after noon. It did not darken all at once. A line of brown-gray appeared at the western horizon, pushing under the pale cloud like a bruise spreading beneath skin. The light went flat. Shadows disappeared. The dripping stopped. Not because the temperature had dropped, but because the air went still, as if the wind had pulled back to take a breath before striking. Marit had seen this once before, in Wisconsin, when she was 12. Her mother had pulled the shutters closed and said, "When the wind stops before a storm, it is not being kind. It is measuring the distance." She brought the mule inside the lean-to and blocked the opening with stacked wood. She filled every pot and pail with water. She stacked 14 armloads of split pine beside the stove. Enough, if the coating held, for 2 days of banking. If the coating did not hold, 14 armloads would last one night. Orrin helped her carry wood until his coughing drove him back inside. His forehead was warm. Not fever warm, not yet, but heading there. Marit mixed willow bark tea and made him drink it, and she wrapped him in the flour sack quilt and the wool blanket and her own coat, and she told him to sleep. The brown-gray line reached halfway up the sky by 3 o'clock. Powder snow began to lift from the ground, not falling snow, but ground snow, the old surface being torn up by wind that was moving somewhere above the ridgeline and pulling at everything below. The first gust hit the cabin at 3:15. It came from the north. The stove pipe rattled. The door shuddered against its latch, and Merritt held the lamp at the north wall and watched the flame. It did not bend. The second gust hit harder. A sound like canvas tearing filled the air outside, which was the wind finding the roof edge and pulling at the tar paper. Snow began to fall, not softly, not in flakes, but in a horizontal sheet of fine, dry crystals that moved with the force of thrown sand. The world outside the windows disappeared. South, north, east, west. Everything was white and moving. Inside, the flame held still. The first hour was almost quiet inside the cabin. Marit could hear the storm as a roar, not a howl, not a whistle, but a constant, low-pitched roar, like a river running over stone, interrupted by sharper gusts that hit the walls in pulses. Each pulse tested a different part of the structure. She felt the cabin flex. The roof poles creaked. The logs shifted against each other in their notches, the green wood contracting in the sudden cold. But the pitch held the seams. The coating, hardened by 2 weeks of curing in cold air, gripped the wood and moved with it, not cracking, not splitting, just flexing the way skin flexes over muscle. The charcoal grit in the mixture gave the surface tooth, preventing the ice and driven snow from sliding under the coating's edge. The tallow kept the pitch from shattering in the dropping temperature. By the end of the first hour, the temperature outside had fallen 20 degrees. Marit could not measure it, but she could feel it in the window glass, which went from cold to burning cold, to too cold to touch. The second hour brought the first complication. Snow drove under the roof edge on the north side where the pitch coverage was thinnest. The junction between the top wall log and the sodden pole roof had been the last section coated, applied in a rush with the broom at full extension while Marit balanced on a chair. She had known the coverage was uneven. She had planned to go back and apply a second pass. She had not had time. A thin line of white appeared along the ceiling on the north wall. Not a drift, a seep. Fine snow sifting through the gap between pitch and sod, pushed by wind that had found the one place where the seal was incomplete. Marit climbed onto the chair. She had kept a small pot of pitch on the stove's warming shelf. Barbro had told her to always have patch material ready, and she dipped a rag in the hot mixture and pressed it into the leak with both hands. The rag stuck. The pitch gripped the wood and the sod edge. She held it until it set, her arms above her head, the chair rocking as a gust hit the wall from outside. The seep stopped. The white line on the ceiling did not grow. Oren watched from his cot, eyes bright with fever, quilt pulled to his chin. "Is the wall breaking?" he asked. "No," Marit said. "The wall is holding. The roof needed help." The third hour brought the second complication, a pounding on the door. Not wind, knuckles. Marit lifted the latch, and the wind tore the door from her hand and slammed it against the inside wall. Snow blasted into the cabin in a horizontal sheet. She could not see who was outside. She reached into the white and grabbed cloth, a coat sleeve stiff with ice, and pulled. Elihu Marsh fell through the doorway carrying his middle child, Ruth, in his arms. The girl was 7 years old, and she was not moving. Her coat was frozen stiff from the chest down. Her face was white. Her eyes were closed. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens next will test every seal Marit built. Marit and Elihu forced the door closed. It took both of them. The latch caught, and the roar outside dropped to a muffled thunder. "Ruth went to bring in the chickens," Elihu said. His voice was flat, stripped of everything except information. "The whiteout hit while she was crossing the yard. I found her against the fence wire. She had followed it the wrong direction." Marit pulled Ruth's frozen coat open. The girl's shirt was dry underneath. The coat had sealed the cold out for a while before her body heat surrendered. Her skin was cold, but not gray. Her fingers were white at the tips. How long was she out? 20 minutes, maybe 30. Marit wrapped Ruth in the wool blanket and put her on the floor beside the stove, close enough for radiant heat, but not touching the iron. She rubbed the girl's hands between hers. After 2 minutes, Ruth's fingers flushed pink, and she whimpered. After 5 minutes, her eyes opened, and she said, "The chickens." "The chickens are gone," Elihu said. He stood in the center of the cabin, dripping meltwater onto the floor, and he looked at the walls. He looked at the north wall, where the lamp flame burned straight on the table. He looked at the ceiling, where the patch held. He looked at the stove, which was burning low. Marit had not fed it in 2 hours, and the air inside the cabin was still warm enough that Ruth's frozen coat was steaming. "How?" he said. Marit did not answer. She was counting wood. 14 armloads stacked, 6 used, 8 remaining. The storm was not done. The 4th hour brought a third arrival. Anson Prawl had been between inspections when the storm hit, caught on the road south of the timber draw with his mare and his canvas satchel. He had made it to a fence line, dismounted, and followed the wire by touch until he found Marit's lean-to. The mare was inside with the mule. Prawl was not. He pounded on the door with his fist because his fingers were too numb to find the latch. Marit opened the door 6 inches, and Prawl pushed through the gap sideways. His right cheek was dead white, frostbitten from the bridge of his nose to his jaw. Ice crystals matted his beard. He said, "Your lean-to is better shelter than my office," and then he sat down on the floor and did not speak for 10 minutes. Marit heated water and pressed a warm, wet cloth against his cheek. The skin flushed red, then purple. Prawl flinched, but held still. He looked at the walls with the expression of a man revising something he had written and finding errors. An hour later, the stovepipe rattled loose. The wind had found the collar, the cracked collar Prawl had noted during his first inspection, the one Marit had sealed with pitch and wire, but had not replaced because a new collar cost $3 she did not have. The wire held, but the pitch seal cracked as the pipe vibrated, and smoke began leaking from the joint into the cabin. Prawl stood up. "Wire," he said. "More wire and a tin patch." Marit found a piece of tin cut from an old coffee can and a length of baling wire. Prawl wrapped the tin around the cracked collar, bent it tight with his knife handle, and wired it down while Marit held the pipe steady. The smoke stopped. Prawl sat back down on the floor, flexed his frostbitten fingers, and said, "That collar will need replacing in the spring." "I know. But tonight it will hold." The cabin held 5 people that night, 3 adults, 2 children, one stove burning low, banked with ash to stretch the coals. 8 armloads of wood remaining. And outside, the storm drove snow so hard and so horizontal that it sounded like sand hitting the walls in waves. Marit lay awake. She expected the cold to come. She expected it the way a person expects pain after a wound, knowing it is arriving, knowing the body cannot stop it, only endure it. The stove had been banked at 10. By midnight, the fire would be embers. By 2 in the morning, the embers would be ash, and then the air inside the cabin would begin its slide toward the air outside, and the pitch would either hold or it would not, and she would know. At midnight, the stove glowed dull red. The air inside the cabin was cool. Not cold. Cool. Marit held her hand 6 inches from the north wall. No movement, no breath of air through the seams. The pitch was holding. At 2 in the morning, the stove was embers. Elihu was asleep, sitting up against the east wall with Ruth curled in his lap. Prawl was on the floor beside the stove, his coat over his chest, his frost-bitten cheek dark against the pale of his beard. Oren slept in his cot. The water pail beside the bed had not frozen. At 4 in the morning, Marit added 2 armloads to the stove and opened the damper. The fire caught. Warmth pushed outward through the cabin, and this time it stayed. It did not leak through the walls. It did not escape through the seams. It filled the 16 by 20-foot space and held the way water fills a sealed vessel, because the vessel was sealed. 6 armloads remaining. More than enough for the day ahead. Elsewhere, the story was different. At the Marsh cabin 2 miles east, Cora Marsh spent the night stuffing quilts and rags against the north wall, where clay chinking had cracked and snow sifted through a keyhole and under the roof boards. Their water bucket froze beside the bed. Cora burned a full cord in 18 hours and still could not keep the cabin above freezing when the wind gusted. Her 2 youngest children slept in the bed with her, curled together for warmth, while the walls breathed cold into the room from every joint. A mile further east, Myron Pate, a bachelor homesteader who lived in a half dugout with a sheet iron stove, nearly died. His stovepipe backed up in the wind, filling the dugout with smoke. He opened the door to clear the air, and the wind blew his fire out. He could not relight it with frozen hands. He was found the next afternoon by a freighter, alive but barely, curled on the dirt floor with his dog pressed against his chest. And 7 miles south, in a tar paper shanty on an exposed ridge, old Jabez Klein died. Klein was 71 and had refused to leave his claim because he believed someone would steal his tools and his cook stove if he was not there to guard them. His shanty was 12 feet square, with walls of rough lumber and tar paper. It had no chinking because it had no logs. The wind entered through the gaps between boards, and drove snow into the room in a fine, continuous sifting that covered everything: the floor, the cot, the cold stove, the old man himself. They found him 2 days later, sitting in his chair beside the stove. The stove was cold. A drift of snow covered his lap. One mitten was frozen to the floor beside his feet, where he had dropped it while trying to load the stove one last time. Marit heard about Klein 3 days after the storm. She did not say anything. She went to the north wall and pressed her palm against it and held it there until the warmth of the wall became the warmth of her hand, and she could not tell which was which. Dawn came gray and still. The wind had stopped some time before light, and the silence after the roar was almost as disorienting as the roar itself. Marit opened the door onto a transformed landscape. Hard drifts sculpted against the cabin walls, rising to window height on the north side, tapering to nothing on the south. The lean-to was buried to its roof. The mule stamped and blew inside, alive, annoyed, hungry, but the drifts stopped at the walls. They did not enter. Marit walked the outside perimeter, stepping through knee-deep snow, running her hand along the pitch-coated surface. The coating was intact. Snow had driven against it all night, and the glossy surface had shed it the way greased iron sheds water. Ice crystals had tried to grip the logs and found no purchase. The charcoal grit in the mixture had done its work. The surface was too rough for ice to form a sheet, and too sealed for driven snow to find a crack. On the north wall, where the 12 daylight slits had been, the pitch was unbroken. Not a single seam had opened. The sill joint, where she had crawled on her knees and packed hot pitch into the gaps with a rag, was dry. The foundation stones were crusted with ice on the windward side, but the pitch above them had held the snow out of the wall. Prahl came outside. He stood beside Marit and looked at the north wall. He did not speak for a full minute. Then he laid his palm flat against the surface, the way he had done during his first inspection, and held it there. "No breath through it," he said. 3 split logs remained from the nightstack inside. 3 adults and 2 children had survived a blizzard that killed a man 7 miles south, in a cabin heated by a stove that had been banked for most of the night, sealed by a coating made from pine resin, charcoal, ash, and deer tallow, applied by a widow with a burned wrist and a ruined broom. The method had held. The math had changed. The question of survival had been answered. But the question of what came after had just begun. The first visitors came for warmth, not apologies. Cora Marsh arrived the afternoon after the storm broke, carrying Ruth wrapped in 2 shawls, and walking beside a sled Elihu had dragged through the drifts. She did not knock. She stood in the yard looking at the walls the way a person looks at something that should not exist, not with disbelief exactly, but with the particular expression of someone who has spent a night freezing and now stands before a building that did not freeze. "Show me where it stopped," she said. Marit showed her the corners first, the junction of 2 walls where logs met at the saddle notch, and the gap between them had been the widest entry point for wind. The pitch filled the notch and gripped both logs, a dark seam of amber black that flexed when Cora pressed it with her thumb, but did not crack. Cora ran her hand along the north wall, stopping at each joint where clay chinking would normally sit. No clay, no gaps, no daylight. Just the continuous pitch shell, rough with charcoal grit, solid as cured leather. "Our water froze beside the bed," Cora said. "I burned a full cord, Marit, and the children still shivered." "How many joints are open in your north wall?" Cora thought about it. 8, maybe 10. Tolef. My husband's chinking is better than yours was, but the logs are the same green pine. They are still drying." "Then that is where the heat went." "Through the joints. Every crack is a mouth that swallows warmth. Cora looked at her daughter, asleep on the sled under the two shawls. Can you show me? Yes. Prawl returned the next morning. He came alone, without the canvas satchel. He brought instead a notebook, a small bound ledger that had been his army issue, now filled with bridge measurements and inspection notes in a cramped, precise hand. He did not inspect the cabin this time. He sat at Marit's table and asked questions. How much resin per wall? How thick the coat? How many batches failed? What proportions of charcoal, ash, and tallow? How long the cure took? How the pitch performed at the stovepipe collar? Whether the roof joint had held or required patching? Whether the sill showed any separation after the temperature swings of the storm night? Marit answered everything. She showed him the board where she had written the proportions in charcoal. She showed him the bent spoon Barbro used to clean the raw resin. She showed him the test ribbon, a cooled thread of pitch wrapped around a nail, which Barbro had taught her was the measure of a good batch. Bend without breaking, ready. Snap, too much ash. Smear, too much fat. Prawl examined the ribbon. He bent it. It flexed and held. He wrote something in the notebook. I told you a wall is not proved in sunshine, he said. I was right. He closed the notebook. And last night proved yours. He pulled a sheet of paper from inside his coat. It was an inspection form, the official county document certifying occupancy, improvement, and habitable dwelling status for a homestead claim. He signed it at the bottom, dated it, and pushed it across the table. Occupied, he said. Improved. Weather tight beyond ordinary claim shanty standards. He looked at her. I have inspected 43 dwellings in this county. This is the first one I have seen survive a January blow without losing heat through the walls. Marit picked up the paper. It weighed almost nothing, a single sheet, signed and dated, that meant Gideon Vale could not contest the claim, could not challenge the occupancy, could not use the winter to take what Tolef had built and Marit had sealed. Mrs. Brecka, Prawl said, standing, I owe you something I do not often give, which is the admission that I was wrong about your material. I was not wrong about the principle. Any wall must prove itself. But I assumed this wall could not, and the storm proved my assumption was the thing that failed. He put on his hat and walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped. You will have visitors, people who want to know the recipe. Be careful who you trust with it. He did not mean the recipe. He meant Vale. The visitors came. Within a week of the storm, 3 families sent someone to Merritt's yard. The Petersons from the draw above Rapid Creek, whose cabin had lost its north wall chinking entirely and was now packed with saddle blankets and flour sacks. A bachelor named Dahl, who lived in a tar paper shanty and had spent the storm night in a neighbor's root cellar. And a young couple, the Solheims, newly arrived from Minnesota, whose cabin was not yet chinked at all, and who had been sleeping in their wagon box inside the structure to stay out of the wind. Each came with the same question. What did you put on your walls? Marit gave proportions by handful, because scales were scarce and no 2 batches of resin were identical. 2 pails of cleaned resin, 1 shovel of powdered charcoal, 1 double handful of sifted ash, a walnut-sized lump of tallow per kettle. She showed them the heating method, the smoke test, the ribbon test. She refused to sell the recipe exclusively. She refused to accept payment for the knowledge. Barbro, who had been present for each of these teaching visits, watched Marit explain the proportions for the 3rd time and said, You forgot the first ingredient. What? Patience. Write that first. Marit looked at her. Barbro was not smiling. but the lines around her eyes had that depth they took on when she was saying something she meant to be remembered. Marit picked up the charcoal and added a word to the proportion board, above the numbers. Patience. The practical skeptic's conversion came differently. Elihu Marsh did not come to Marit's yard with questions. He did not send Cora. He came one evening after dark, alone, and stood at the gate without entering until Marit saw him through the window and opened the door. "I want to see the kettle," he said. She brought him to the fire ring. The kettle was cold, tipped upside down to keep rain out, crusted with old pitch that would need scraping before the next batch. Elihu crouched beside it and examined the residue. He picked at a dried ribbon of pitch with his thumbnail. It flexed. "My middle wall is opening," he said. "The log above the window on the north side. I can fit 3 fingers in the gap." "How much resin can you gather?" "If I start tomorrow, maybe 10 pounds by the end of the week." "That is enough for a storm belt. Sill line, corners, window frame, door frame, roof joint, and the widest checks. You do not need to coat every surface, just the places where the wind enters." Elihu stood. He looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his expression was not gratitude or admiration. It was the particular discomfort of a practical man who has been shown that practical and correct are not the same thing. He had told Marit her method did not make sense. The storm had told him he was wrong. He was here now not because he had changed his mind about the risk, but because his children had been cold and his wife had been frightened, and his water had frozen beside the bed while Marit's had not. "I will gather the resin," he said. "Will you show me the heating?" "Barbro will show you. She is better at reading the smoke." "The old woman?" "Her name is Barbro Asen, and she taught me everything I did not learn from my mother." Elihu nodded. He did not apologize for having doubted. He did not need to. The fact that he was standing in Marit's yard at nightfall asking about kettle technique was apology enough, and they both knew it. Gideon Vale's response to the storm was not conversion, it was recalculation. Within a week of the blizzard, 3 things had changed in Vale's position. First, Prawl's signed inspection meant the claim was secure. Vale could not contest it through the land office. Second, Marit's method was spreading. If it worked for others, the demand for resin and pitch materials would rise, and Vale's general store was the only supply point for purchased rosin, tallow, and kettles within 20 miles. Third, and most dangerously for Marit, Vale understood that the method's success made Marit influential in a way that had nothing to do with money or land. People were coming to her, listening to her, taking her proportions home and trying them on their own walls. Vale did not attack the method directly after the storm. He was too intelligent for that. Instead, he shifted. He told the men at the store that the coating was useful but dangerous in untrained hands. He suggested that fire insurance, which no claim shanty carried because no claim shanty was insured, would be impossible for any pitch-coated dwelling. He implied, without stating, that Marit was building a reputation she could not sustain. And he began buying resin. Boys from the settlement brought pitch knots and resin blisters to the store, and Vale paid them pennies per pound. Less than the labor was worth, but more than the boys had, which was nothing. He stockpiled the resin in his warehouse. He did not use it. He did not sell it at fair weight. He waited. Marit learned about the buying from one of the Peterson boys, who told her that Vale had paid him 8 cents for 5 pounds of clean resin and that another boy had been paid 6 cents for the same amount the day before. "He is buying the supply," Marit told Barbro. "He cannot stop people from learning the method, so he is trying to own the material." Barbro said nothing for a moment. She was stirring a small batch. not for application, but for test ribbons she was making for the Solheim family. Finally, she said, "A man who cannot build a thing always tries to own the pieces." The weeks after the storm became a different kind of work. Marit was no longer fighting for survival. She was fighting for something harder to name, the right to share what she knew without having it taken from her. Barbro came every day now, not because Marit needed teaching, but because neither of them wanted to work alone. They refined the mixture together. Barbro taught Marit to test a cooled ribbon by bending it around a nail. If it snapped, the batch had too much ash, and the next kettle needed less. If it smeared, too much tallow, and the next batch needed more charcoal for tooth. If it bent smooth and held, the proportions were right. They argued about application. Barbro believed in thick coats, one heavy pass that filled every crack and built up a surface a quarter-inch deep. Marit found that two thin passes bonded better, the first filling the wood grain and the second sealing over it. They tested both methods on a section of fence rail and checked them after a week of freezing nights. Marit's two-pass method showed no cracking. Barbro's thick pass had one hairline crack at the edge where the pitch met bare wood. Barbro studied the crack. She did not concede. She said, "My method works on flat surfaces. Yours works on round logs. We're both right. And neither of us is finished learning." It was the closest they came to a genuine disagreement, and it deepened the work instead of damaging it. Marit began keeping notes on a board nailed inside the cabin, which proportions worked in which temperatures, how long each batch took to cure, which resin sources produced the cleanest material. Barbro added her own notes in a cramped hand that Marit sometimes could not read, and when she asked for translation, Barbro would say the word aloud in Finnish before finding the English, as if the knowledge lived in one language and had to be carried into another. In March, as the worst cold released its grip and the days lengthened enough to work past 4 o'clock, Barbro told Marit the story she had been carrying. They were sitting beside the fire ring, waiting for a batch to reach temperature, and Barbro said, "My husband's name was Aino. He built tar kilns on Lake Superior for a timber company that sold pitch to shipbuilders. I cooked for the crew and watched the kilns. After 2 years, I knew more about tar than any of the men, because they rotated out every season, and I stayed." She stirred the batch. The smoke rose white and steady. When Aino died, the kiln wall collapsed. The company sent a new foreman. He asked who had been running the operation. The men pointed at Aino's grave. They did not point at me. She lifted the spoon and checked the ribbon. Too thin. She set it back. I ran the kilns for 3 more months before the foreman realized I was the one adjusting his temperatures and fixing his pores. He did not thank me. He told me to go back to the cookhouse. Marit said, "What did you do?" I went back to the cookhouse, and every time a batch failed, I waited for him to ask me why. It took 6 batches. And then he asked, and after that, he let me work the kilns, but he signed his name on the production logs. Did you stay? For 2 more years. Then I walked away. I walked all the way to Dakota because I heard there was land for women who could prove they deserved it. She looked at the cabin. I never proved it. I never filed a claim. I was too old and too tired and too angry, but I kept what I knew. Marit looked at the old woman, her smoke-cured coat, her leather hands, her eyes that held more knowledge about heat and resin and patience than any book Marit had ever seen. She said, "You are proving it now." Barbro did not answer. She pulled the batch off the coals and began adding charcoal, 1 pinch at a time, and the smoke changed color the way it always did when the proportions were right. From white to a faint blue-gray that smelled of turpentine and something sweeter underneath, like warm amber held against the sun. Barbro Asen died in late February of 1890, 2 years after the storm. She had walked through sleet to deliver salve to a child at the Dahl homestead, 3 miles from her dugout. The walk back was into the wind. She made it to within a quarter-mile of her door before her legs gave out. A freighter found her sitting against a fence post the next morning, alive but breathing in shallow gasps that sounded like paper tearing. He carried her inside and built her fire, and rode to Marit's place. Marit arrived before noon. Barbro was on her cot, wrapped in the elk-hide coat she had never been without, breathing in a rhythm that Marit recognized from her mother's last days, the rhythm of a body conserving everything it had left for the work of staying alive. "The salve," Barbro said. Her voice was thin but clear. "I left it on the doll table. Make sure the child gets it on the burn, not beside it." "I will." "And the next batch. The resin from the south draw is cleaner than the north. The north trees have too much sapwood. It foams." "I know. You taught me." Barbro closed her eyes. She breathed. After a moment she said, "The test ribbon, by the door." Marit looked. Nailed to the frame beside Barbro's door was a cooled thread of pitch, wrapped around an iron nail. It was Barbro's last test, a ribbon made from the final batch they had mixed together the previous autumn. It hung there the way a carpenter's level hangs beside a workbench, not decoration, but proof that the tool was true. Marit sat with her until dark. Barbro did not speak again. She breathed in her paper-tearing rhythm, and sometime in the small hours the rhythm changed, and then it stopped, and the cabin was quiet except for the stove and the wind. The old woman's cabin smelled of smoke, dried mint, and pine. On the table beside the cot, a cooled thread of amber curled around a nail without breaking. It was the last thing Barbro's hands had made, and it was perfect, flexible, strong, dark with charcoal, and warm to the touch from the heat of the room where she had rendered it. Marit held it between her fingers and felt the slight give that meant the tallow was right, and the slight resistance that meant the ash was right, and the roughness that meant the charcoal was right. She pressed it to her lips, and it smelled like every batch they had ever made together: turpentine, coal smoke, warm fat, and the faint sweetness of pine that had nothing to do with perfume, and everything to do with trees that bled when cut and healed when left alone. She took the test ribbon from the door frame when she left. She nailed it beside her own door the next morning. It hung there for years. Spring of 1890 brought water instead of wind. The thaw came fast that year, 3 days of warm rain on deep snowpack, and Rapid Creek rose from its winter trickle to a churning brown torrent that jumped its banks and spread across the bottomland where the lower schoolhouse and 2 claim cabins sat. The flood was not deep, 3 feet at its highest, but 3 feet of moving water against a structure built on flat stones with no foundation was enough to shift walls, lift floors, and push mud and debris through every gap in every joint. The schoolhouse door cracked under the pressure. Water entered through the split plank and began filling the single room where books, slates, a small stove, and 3 months of the school teacher's accumulated materials sat on a floor that was already buckling. Marit heard about the flooding from Elihu, who rode to her place at dawn with water staining his boots to the knee. His own cabin was on higher ground, safe, but the schoolhouse was not, and neither were the 2 lower cabins, the Dahl place, and a newer shanty occupied by a family named Lund, whose name Marit did not yet know. She arrived at the schoolhouse by mid-morning with a kettle, a sack of prepared pitch, and a bundle of canvas scraps she had been saving for patch material. The water was 2 feet deep around the building and rising slowly. The door plank was split from top to bottom, and creek water pushed through the gap in a steady, muddy stream. This was not a wind problem, it was a water problem. But the principle was the same: stop the entry, seal the gap, make the barrier continuous. Marit heated pitch over a coal bed she built on the schoolhouse porch above the waterline. She soaked canvas strips in the hot mixture and pressed them over the cracked door plank, layering pitch and cloth until the gap was sealed, not waterproof, not permanent, but enough to slow the entry from a stream to a seep. She worked the door frame next, packing pitch-soaked rags into the gap between frame and wall where the water was finding its way around the edges. Inside, the school teacher Sue, a woman named Elsa Grindheim, who had come from Iowa and had never seen a creek flood, was stacking books on the highest shelf and weeping. Marit told her to stop stacking and start moving the stove parts to the porch. Books could dry. A stove could rust beyond use. By afternoon, the water had stabilized. The patched door held. The schoolhouse was wet inside, but not filling. 2 men from the settlement arrived with a makeshift sled, planks lashed to runners, and Marit used heated pitch and ash-thickened resin to seal the cracks between the sled planks so they could haul books and stove parts across the flooded ground without soaking them. She worked without Barbro. For the first time since the old woman had knocked the burning kettle off the stones with a peeled pine pole, Marit made every decision alone: which proportions, which heat, which application. She heard Barbro's voice in her hands, not in words, but in the rhythm of the work, the way she checked the smoke color without thinking, the way she tested the ribbon around a nail before committing a batch to canvas. The flood receded in 2 days. The schoolhouse survived. The doll cabin lost its floor but kept its walls. The loon shanty, which had no pitch coating, shifted 4 inches on its foundation and had to be jacked back into place by 6 men with poles. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that the work people mock is often the work that saves them. Vale's warehouse leaked during the flood. Not the front, which faced the road and was built of milled lumber with decent joints. The rear, which faced the creek and was built of rough-sawn planks with gaps between them that Vale had never bothered to seal because the creek had never risen that high before. The water entered through the rear wall and soaked 20 sacks of flour that were stacked on the floor instead of on pallets. It soaked a case of lamp oil whose tin containers had already been dented in shipping. It soaked the bottom shelf of dry goods, thread, buttons, salt in paper bags, sugar in cloth, and it soaked the resin that Vale had been buying from the settlement boys, which sat in wooden crates on the floor, and being already sticky, absorbed the creek water and became a congealed, useless mass. Vale discovered the damage when the water receded and the smell hit him. Wet flour has a particular stench, sweet and sour simultaneously, like bread that has been left to rot in a warm room. He stood in his warehouse looking at 20 sacks of ruined flour and a season's worth of hoarded resin turned to mud, and he understood something that Marit had understood months earlier. A wall that does not seal is a wall that does not protect, and the things behind it are only as safe as the weakest joint. He sent a boy to Marit's place with a message. Would she come look at the warehouse wall? Marit went. She brought Elihu, because Elihu had a team and a sled, and because Marit did not want to be alone with Vale. They stood in the warehouse and surveyed the damage. Vale stood behind them with his arms crossed, not speaking, his jaw set in the particular way of a man who needs help from someone he has publicly mocked and is calculating how to accept it without losing face. Marit looked at the rear wall. The gaps between the planks were irregular, some 1/4 inch, some nearly 1/2 inch. Creek water had entered through every one. She turned to Vale. "I will seal this wall," she said. But first you open the doors. They are open, not for air, for people. The Lund family has no floor. The doll cabin is full of mud. They need dry shelter while they repair. You have a building with a roof and a stove. Vale's jaw tightened. This is a store, not a boarding house. It is a building full of wet flour and ruined stock. You are not selling anything today. Let 2 families sleep on your floor tonight, and I will seal your wall tomorrow. Elihu said nothing. He stood beside the sled and watched. The silence stretched. One night, Vale said, until the Lund floor is repaired, 3 days, maybe 4. Vale looked at the ruined flour sacks, at the creek-stained walls, at Marit standing in his warehouse offering to do the thing she had been mocked for doing, on the condition that he do something decent first. He did not become kind. He did not become generous. He became a man who saw no alternative, and he said, 3 days. Marit sealed the warehouse wall the next morning. It took 4 hours and 6 gallons of pitch applied over canvas strips, the same technique she had used on the schoolhouse door. When she finished, the wall was dark and rough and ugly, and it was sealed, and Vale stood looking at it with the expression of a man staring at a lesson he had refused to learn and now could not unlearn. He did not thank her. He did not apologize for the coffin remark. He opened the warehouse to the Lund family that evening and charged them nothing because Elihu was watching and 3 other men from the settlement were watching, and the cost of being seen refusing was higher than the cost of being seen relenting. By summer of 1890, Marit's yard had changed. 2 kettles sat on stone pads near the fire ring. The original battered iron kettle, now permanently crusted with pitch, and a second one she had traded for with a freighter who took 3 gallons of prepared pitch in exchange. Drying racks made of peeled pine poles held strips of test ribbon at various stages of cure. Labeled sacks of charcoal and ash sat under a canvas lean-to. A ledger, the first paper record of the proportions, replacing the charcoal marks on the board, lay on the table inside, with entries for each family taught and the results they reported. She taught the Petersons and the Solheims in the spring. She taught Dahl and the Lunds in early summer. Cora Marsh learned the kettle test, the smoke color, the ribbon flex, and became better at judging heat than Elihu, who was impatient with the heating and twice let batches turn blue-black because he was loading wood instead of watching smoke. Marit made Elihu apply his own coating. She stood beside him while he worked the broom on his north wall, and she did not take the broom when he struggled with the check fills, and she did not adjust his stroke when the pitch went on too thick at the corners. He said, "Just do it yourself. You're faster." She said, "Your hands must remember before the weather asks. I will not be standing in your yard in January." He finished the north wall himself. The coat was uneven, thick in some places, thin in others, a visible record of a man learning a skill his hands did not yet own, but it sealed. The smoke test showed no air movement through the joints. The ribbon test showed the proportions were close enough. Cora stood in the yard and looked at the wall and said, "It is the ugliest thing I have ever seen." Elihu said, "It is the warmest ugly thing you will ever touch." He was right. That winter, the marsh cabin held heat through 2 cold snaps without losing its water pail. Cora burned less than half the wood she had burned the previous year. She told Marit this at the store, in front of 3 women who had not yet tried the method, and 2 of them asked for the proportions that afternoon. The knowledge was spreading, not because Marit sold it, not because she promoted it, but because it worked, and because cold was the one opponent that every homesteader on the eastern edge of the Black Hills shared. But Marit was not just a teacher now. She was a person people came to, a person whose yard had kettles and racks and a ledger, a person who had survived a blizzard that killed a man and had sealed a schoolhouse during a flood and had made Gideon Vale open his doors. The visibility made the work possible. The visibility also made her a target for anyone who wanted to own what she freely gave. And Vale, standing in his warehouse behind a pitch-sealed wall he had not wanted, watching the resin he had hoarded turn to useless mud in creek-soaked crates, was already thinking about what came next. The storm belt changed everything. Marit had coated her entire cabin because she had no choice. 1.5 cords of wood, and a child with a cough and a winter that would not forgive incomplete work. But most families did not need a full coat. Most families had 3 or 4 or 6 places where the wind entered, and those places were predictable. The sill line, where the bottom log met the foundation and settlement, had opened a gap. The corners where 2 walls joined and the notchwork was rarely perfect. The window frames where rough-cut openings left irregular gaps between log and frame. The door frame where constant opening and closing loosened every seal. The roof joint where wall logs met the sod or pole roof, and movement between 2 different materials created a permanent seam. And the widest checks, the deep splits in individual logs where drying had cracked the wood open and exposed the interior to wind. Seal those 6 places, and a cabin that bled heat through every joint became a cabin that held warmth the way a good stove holds coals. Marit called it the storm belt, not because the name was clever, but because it described what it was. A belt of pitch around the vulnerable places, cinching the cabin tight against the weather the way a belt cinches a coat against the cold. 8 to 12 gallons of prepared pitch instead of 40. 2 days of work for a family instead of 3 weeks. Materials gathered from the same timber draw that supplied their firewood. By the autumn of 1890, she had taught the method to 11 families. By the following spring, 6 more had learned it from the first 11. The knowledge moved the way useful knowledge always moves on a frontier, not through books or advertisements or official channels, but through neighbors who had tried it and found that it worked, telling other neighbors who were tired of waking to frozen water pails and cracked chinking and drafts that no amount of mud could stop. The teaching happened in Marit's yard, at the fire ring, with the kettles and the drying racks and the labeled sacks. She taught in groups when she could, 3 or 4 adults from different claims, standing around the coal bed, watching the smoke, learning to read the color change that meant the difference between a good batch and a ruined one. She taught individually when she had to. A widow from Box Elder who could not leave her children long enough for a group session, a bachelor from the Ridge who was too proud to learn in front of others but not too proud to learn. She never charged for the knowledge. She charged for labor when families wanted her to apply the coating herself, $2 a day plus materials, which was fair for skilled work and less than a carpenter would have asked. But the proportions, the method, the smoke test, the ribbon test, the order of ingredients, the patience that Barbaro had insisted was the first ingredient, those she gave freely because they had been given freely to her, and because the alternative was to become what Vale wanted to become, a person who owned what should be shared. Not everyone learned well. A man named Garrett from the South overheated 3 consecutive batches because he used flame instead of coals, and refused to believe the smoke color mattered until his 4th kettle produced a brittle, useless crust that crumbled when he touched it. Marit stood beside him during the 5th attempt and said nothing until the smoke turned gray, and then she said, "Pull it now." And he pulled it, and the batch was good. And he looked at her with the expression of a man who has just realized that the person teaching him is better at the thing than he will ever be, and that this is not humiliating but fortunate. Cora Marsh became the 2nd best pitch worker on the Eastern Draws. She organized what she called coating days, a Saturday when women from 3 or 4 claims would gather at one cabin with kettles and prepared resin and apply a storm belt in a single day. The men cut and hauled dead pitch knots from the timber draw. The women cleaned, heated, mixed, and applied. Children counted wall lengths in charcoal marks the way Orrin had counted Marit's. Prahl, in his unofficial capacity as claim inspector, began recommending the storm belt in his notes for exposed cabins near the timber draws. He did not mandate it. He did not have the authority. But he wrote in his cramped army hand that cabins sealed with the Brekke method show measurably improved heat retention and reduced fuel consumption during winter months, and he left copies of his notes at the land office for incoming settlers to read. The Brekke method. Marit did not choose the name. Prahl gave it, and it stuck, the way names stick when they describe something real. She would have preferred Barbro's method, or no name at all, but the community needed a word for what she had taught them, and the community chose the name of the woman whose yard they had stood in while they learned. Vale's final confrontation came in the spring of 1891, and it came not with a speech but with a ledger. The winter of 90 to 91 had been milder than the blizzard year, but 2 hard cold snaps in January tested every cabin on the eastern draws. The storm-belted cabins held. The uncoated ones suffered the usual losses: cracked chinking, frozen water, burnt-through wood piles, sleepless nights feeding stoves that could not keep pace with walls that could not keep wind. 3 families who had not yet adopted the method did so immediately after the second cold snap. 2 of them came to Marit. 1 went to Cora. Vale watched the adoption spread with the attention of a man watching a market shift. He had lost the battle over resin supply. The hoarded stock had been ruined in the flood, and the timber draw produced more resin than any one buyer could corner. He had lost the battle over reputation. The coffin remark had become a joke that was told on him now, not on Marit. He had lost the battle over the claim. Prahl's signed inspection had closed that door permanently. What he had not lost was Tollef's debt. The note still said $41. Marit had not paid it. She had not acknowledged it. She had treated it as what it was, an inflated claim against a dead man, padded by $15 of Vale's arithmetic. And she had ignored it the way a person ignores a dog that barks but does not bite. In April of 91, Vale decided to bite. He filed a lien notice at the land office, claiming that the unpaid debt of $41 against the Brekke claim constituted grounds for a creditor's interest in the property improvements. The filing was not a foreclosure. It was a cloud on the title, a legal shadow that would follow the claim through proving up and prevent Marit from receiving clear title until the debt was settled. He delivered the notice himself. He rode to Marit's yard on a Tuesday afternoon, dismounted, and handed her the paper with the expression of a man playing a card he has been holding for 3 years. $41, he said, plus interest accrued, $53 now. You can pay or you can carry the lien. Marit read the paper. She had expected this. She had expected it for 2 years, since the day Vale offered $40 for the claim, and she said nothing, and he rode away. The debt was his leverage, and as long as it existed, he had a hook in the property that she could not remove without paying the amount he claimed. The original receipt was $26, Marit said. The original receipt was for tools and stove credit extended to your husband. The terms included interest. Tollef's copy of the receipt said 26, no interest terms. Tollef's copy is not the store's copy. Tollef's copy is in the land office file. I submitted it with the occupancy proof. Vale's expression changed, not dramatically. He was too practiced for that. But a tightness appeared around his eyes that had not been there a moment before. He had not known that Marit had filed Tollef's receipt. He had assumed, as he assumed about most things involving Marit, that a widow with $32 and a sick child would not have thought to protect herself with paper. A receipt is not a contract. he said. A receipt is what you charged, $26. If your store copy says 41, then your store copy is wrong, and the land office will see that when I prove up. Vale stood in the yard. Behind him, the kettles sat on their stone pads. The drying racks held test ribbons. The fire ring was cold but ready. In the doorway, Orrin, now 8, taller, his cough diminished since the cabin had been sealed, watched with the steady gaze of a child who has learned to read adults by watching them instead of listening to them. Vale said, I will accept 26, in cash, today. I do not have 26 in cash today. Then the lien stays. Marit folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. The lien stays until I prove up. When I prove up, the land office will compare your claim against Tolef's receipt, and the receipt will stand, and your lien will be worth what your arithmetic is worth, which is nothing. Vale looked at her for a long moment. Then he mounted his horse and rode out. He did not speak to her again until the flood. The second flood came in May of 1891, smaller than the first but aimed differently. Rapid Creek jumped its north bank instead of its south, and the water that had threatened the schoolhouse the previous year now threatened Vale's warehouse from the opposite direction. His front wall, the milled lumber wall with decent joints, took the brunt. Water rose 18 inches inside the building before anyone could move the stock. This time, the flour was on pallets. Vale had learned that much, but the lower shelves held new stock, bolts of cloth, hardware in paper packaging, a case of patent medicine in glass bottles that floated off the shelf and shattered against the far wall, and the rear wall, which Marit had sealed the previous year, held. The pitch and canvas patch stopped the water from entering through the back. The front was the problem. Vale sent for Marit. She came. She brought Elihu and 2 kettles and 12 gallons of prepared pitch, and she stood in the flooded warehouse looking at Vale's stock floating in Brown Creek water, and she said what she had said the year before. Open the doors. They are open. The water came through them. Not for water, for the Petersons. Their root cellar flooded. They have nowhere to store their seed potatoes, and if the seed rots, they have no crop next year. Vale stood in 18 inches of water in his own store and looked at a woman who was offering to save his wall on the condition that he help someone else first. He looked at Elihu, who was watching. He looked at the men who had waded in to help move stock, who were also watching. Marit, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. I will store the Peterson seed, and I will tear up Tolef's note. The warehouse went silent, except for the sound of water. The original note, Marit said. $26. Torn up in front of witnesses. 26 in front of witnesses. Marit looked at Elihu. Elihu nodded once. Vale waded to his counter, opened a drawer that was not yet submerged, and pulled out a folded paper. He held it up so the men in the warehouse could see it. $26, Tolef Breka, paid in full by services rendered. He tore it in half, then in quarters, and dropped the pieces into the floodwater, where they floated for a moment and then sank. Marit sealed the front wall that afternoon. It took 6 hours and every gallon of pitch she had brought. When she finished, the wall was dark and sealed and ugly, and the water level inside the warehouse had dropped 2 inches because the entry had been stopped. Vale did not become kind. He did not become generous. He did not become a different man. He became a man whose wall had been sealed by the method he had mocked, whose debt had been torn up in his own store, whose arithmetic had been corrected in front of witnesses. He was constrained now, not by conversion, but by consequence. The community had seen him need what he had ridiculed, and the community would remember. He sold resin after that at posted weight instead of guesswork. He stocked tallow and charcoal alongside his other goods. He never called it the break-a method. He called it the coating. But he sold the materials and he kept his mouth shut about coffins. And that was enough. Amos Marsh arrived in the autumn of 1891. He was Elihu's brother, 38 years old, a wheelwright from Nebraska who had come west after his wife died of scarlet fever and left him with a shop full of tools and no reason to stay. He was quiet in the way that wheelwrights are quiet, men who spend their days shaping wood with draw knives and spoke shaves, listening to the grain, feeling the curve, working by touch as much as by sight. He had hands like Barbaro's, not rough from neglect, but rough from use, the calluses earned and specific. He came to repair Marit's sled runners, which had cracked during the flood work. Elihu had sent him, saying only that his brother did good wood repair and needed the work. Amos arrived with a draw knife, a spoke shave, and a canvas roll of chisels, and he spent 3 hours on the runners without speaking more than 6 sentences, all of them about the wood. Marit watched him work. He did not hurry. He did not force the grain. He cut with the draw knife in long, even strokes, removing splinters and roughness until the runner was smooth and true. When he found a crack that ran deeper than the surface, he did not fill it with a wedge. He cut a new piece, fitted it, and pegged it with dowels he shaped from a scrap of ash. "You could have filled the crack," Marit said. Amos looked up. A fill holds until the next load. A fitted piece holds until the wood itself gives out. Marit recognized the philosophy. It was her own. It was Barbaro's. Fix the thing properly, or do not fix it at all. Stop the air. Do not just slow it. Seal the crack. Do not just cover it. She showed him the kettles. He asked questions, not about the proportions, which he could learn later, but about the heating, how the coal bed was managed, how the smoke was read, how the temperature was controlled. These were a craftsman's questions, asked by a man who understood that heat was a tool and that controlling a tool was the difference between work and destruction. He built Merritt a better kettle stand that week, flat stones mortared with clay and pitch, with a windscreen on the north side and a shelf for the test spoon and a ribbon nail. It was the kind of improvement that only someone who understood workflow would think to make everything within reach. Nothing in the path of the smoke, the coal bed shielded from gusts that had caused 3 ruined batches the previous year. Marit said, "You built this the way I coat a wall. You found the places where the problem enters, and you sealed them." Amos looked at the stand. "I built it the way I build a wheel. Find the weakness in the circle and reinforce it. Everything else holds because that one place does." Their courtship happened through work. There was no other way it could have happened. Marit did not have time for social calls, and Amos did not have the disposition. He came to repair things. She showed him the pitchwork. He built frames and stands and drying racks that made the operation faster. She taught him the smoke test, the ribbon test, the proportions. He admitted one evening while they were cleaning a batch kettle with sand that he had come west thinking every problem yielded to iron and leverage. "And," Marit said, "and some problems are solved by sealing what nobody can see." He scraped a curl of hardened pitch from the kettle rim. "You cannot hammer wind. You cannot nail cold. You can only stop them from entering." They married in the spring of 1893. The ceremony was at the cabin, the Amber Cabin, as the settlement had begun calling it, though the pitch had darkened to near black by then, and only the protected south-facing seams still showed the original amber color. Prahl attended. Elihu and Korah stood as witnesses. Orrin, now 11, stood beside Amos with an expression that was not suspicion and not enthusiasm, but something more durable than either itzing, the recognition that this man treated his hands and his tools and the woman he was marrying with the same careful attention. and that careful attention was the thing Orrin understood best, because he had watched it save his life. The years compress the way years do when the crisis is over and the work becomes routine. Merritt and Amos expanded the cabin, a second room to the south, framed and chinked and coated before the first snow. A daughter, Solveig, born in '94, who grew up knowing the smell of pitch the way other children knew the smell of bread. Orrin learned the method and improved it, developing a thinner mixture for interior seams that did not carry the turpentine smell and could be applied in closed rooms without choking. Merritt's yard became a regular stop for new settlers arriving on the eastern draws. Prohl sent them. Cora sent them. Even the land office, where Prohl's notes sat in the incoming settler file, sent them. They came for the proportions, for the demonstration, for the smoke test, and the ribbon test, and the patience that Merritt insisted was the first ingredient. Some learned well. Some needed 3 visits. Some sent their wives, who learned faster because they were the ones who stayed awake at night, feeding the stove, and knew exactly where the heat was leaving. The storm belt became ordinary. That was its greatest achievement. Not that it was remarkable, but that it stopped being remarkable. New settlers were told to seal their sill before buying curtains. Coating days became social events. The Brecca method became the coating, and then just sealing, and then something so assumed that people forgot there had been a time when it did not exist, and cabins simply leaked, and everyone accepted it. By 1895, more than 20 families around the Rapid Creek and Box Elder draws had used some form of the method. Not every cabin became an amber house. Most only sealed the vulnerable places, the storm belt, the 6 points of entry. That was the point. The lesson spread because it was adaptable, because it did not require coating an entire building to make a difference, because a widow with a flour sack of resin and a bent spoon and a ruined broom had shown that stopping the wind was more important than fighting it. After statehood, the cabin was expanded again and sided over with milled boards ordered by rail. The pitch shell disappeared beneath the new exterior. Visitors forgot how strange it once looked. The amber cabin became a white cabin, ordinary, indistinguishable from every other improved homestead on the draws, its original surface hidden like a scar beneath a shirt. Merritt Brecca lived on the claim into her 60s. She saw rough claim shanties replaced by framed rooms, plank siding, and glass windows. She saw the sod roofs give way to shingles, the leather hinges give way to iron, the dirt floors give way to boards. She saw the settlement grow from a cluster of claims into a town with a post office and a school and a church with a bell that could be heard across the creek. She taught pitchwork until her hands could no longer hold the broom steady, and then she taught by voice, sitting beside the fire ring while younger women worked the kettle, and she told them when the smoke was wrong. She died in 1921 after a lung fever in the cabin that Tolef had built, and she had sealed and Amos had expanded, and Orrin now managed. Solveig was teaching school in Rapid City. Orrin was 40, with children of his own, running the claim as a small ranch with timber rights on the draw. Years later, how many does not matter, only that enough had passed for the white siding to rot at the bottom where rain splashed and snow drifted. Orrin pulled a board from the north wall to replace it. Behind the board, beneath the siding, under the layer of tar paper that the carpenter had tacked over the original logs, the pitch was still there. Dark, almost black, roughened with charcoal grit that had not softened in 30 years. In one protected seam where the siding had kept rain and sun away, the surface still held a faint amber gloss, the color of the original coat, the color of heated resin before the charcoal darkened it, the color of the beads Merritt's mother had pressed into washtub seams in Wisconsin. Orrin pressed it with his thumb. The pitch gave slightly. It did not crumble. It did not crack. It flexed the way it had always flexed, the tallow keeping it alive and cold, the ash giving it stiffness, the charcoal giving it tooth, the resin gripping the wood it had been pressed against by a woman with a burned wrist and a flat-cut broom, and a reason to believe that stopping the wind was worth more than fighting it. He thought about what Vale had said. He could hear the words clearly. Though he had been 6 years old when they were spoken, and had heard them repeated 100 times since, not with bitterness, but with the disbelief of a community that had watched a prediction become a punchline. She is varnishing a coffin before she climbs inside it. Orrin said the words aloud, standing beside the opened wall with a rotted siding board in one hand. The cabin had not been a coffin. It had been a stopped mouth. The wind came looking for every crack in these walls and found fewer than it needed. He nailed the new siding board into place over the pitch. The amber seam disappeared behind fresh-cut pine, but the seal remained, invisible, unremarkable, and holding.